Hey everyone, and welcome to this next episode of the KOG, that is the Kingdom of God Entrepreneur Show. I'm your host, Stephen Harris. I'm coming to you from my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina. And we're going to continue on this series about the most famous businessman in history, aka Abraham, the Patriarch, which is who he is today. So we're going to continue on where we left off last week.
Please be so kind to support us by clicking the like button and subscribing to our channel to be notified of all future content.
All right, here we are, the most famous businessman in history, part 2. So as I discussed last week, there are 7.8 billion people on Earth right now, according to Google, and a total of 4.3037 billion of those people, which is a bit more than half, 55% total actually, are coming from one of the three major influential faiths around the world, which would be Christianity, number 1, Islam, number 2, and Judaism, number 3. A lot of other faiths there, but Abraham is the patriarch of all three of these faiths, and that's why I'm saying he's the most famous businessman in history, because he has the majority of the population in one of those faiths that he was credited for starting. But aside from that, he also has a lot of influence in let's say, Judeo-Christian or Islamic nations, simply because of the influence that those religions are having on it in different parts of the world. So let's move forward. As I said, that's 55% of the current population. And let's move on to part 2. So right now we're going to look at chapter 13. And I've broken this up into the scriptures that I felt were most relevant to the point I'm trying to make. See, we tend to look at Abraham as the first one to have that faith. He's well known for attempting to sacrifice his son Isaac because God had given him that command, who was his one son of promise, even though he did have other children. Basically, this idea that Abraham is known for the religious element, it tends to be how we look at him. But I look at him now through the lens of the fact he was a businessman. He made very shrewd decisions that have an impact on the world, and we definitely, who are believers, can tap into those principles and follow a lot of the lessons that he lived by, or a lot of the principles he lived by. And so that's what I want to highlight here. So in chapter 13 of Genesis, this is coming from the New King James Version of the Bible. Verse 1 says, "Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him to the south. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and in gold." So this man had a caravan. He had his wife, he had his nephew with him, and he got around from point A to point B. He was not stationary, right? You think about like the food trucks and how a food truck is a restaurant. Sometimes you have really fancy restaurants, really nice restaurants that will have a food truck, and they will go to where the crowds are instead of always forcing the crowds to come to them. Abraham was mobile. He was not just stuck in one place. He was not letting other people dictate to him what he could and couldn't do. He really had a connection with the Lord, and a lot of wealth came out of that, right? There are extra biblical texts like the book of Jasher that imply that Abraham did have means prior to his time moving to Canaan. But if we're using the scriptures, the canon of scriptures, the Bible, the Old Testament, the Tanakh, or the Torah is another word, as a reference point, Abraham just kind of appears after the Tower of Babel has the nation split. And what we know is he was rich, right? He was 75 years old at this time. Verse 3, it says, and he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abraham called on the name of the Lord. So basically, he had already marked his territory in the sense of, I don't mean that like a dog would mark their territory, but he had already decided this is a place where he is going to be a visionary, be one to create wealth from the land, to be an influencer to the land. That's one of those things. Anywhere Abraham went, he had a major impact on that area. And one of the sad things I see so often in Christianity, I think about my hometown of Los Angeles, where I was born and raised. I've been in North Carolina here for almost 9 years, but there were parts of LA where I could drive down a boulevard for miles, and there would literally be a different church on every street corner on these terrible parts of LA where there's a lot of crime, a lot of poverty. Sometimes you would literally have two churches from the same denomination literally across the street from each other, different pastors, different congregations, but they were right there facing each other. And that always bothered me, that these churches would not really have an impact on their communities. That wasn't a problem with Abraham. It's interesting because I remember I worked for Starbucks twice, actually. Once in 2004, I believe, and the second time was 2010 to 2011. And Starbucks was out making an impact on the culture. They would have days where the employees would have to come together and volunteer, maybe clean up a neighborhood, or they have to maybe clean up graffiti or clean up a neighborhood. And then the employees weren't paid for their time, but they were given like coffee, refreshments, stuff like that, of course. But the idea was that they had that corporate social responsibility. And going back in history, more than 3,000 years, here Abraham was a man who was known for having an impact on culture. And there's other extra biblical sources like Josephus, where that is spoken of. So Abraham was a man of influence, and he was wealthy. Okay, and that's something that, hey, Christianity is so divided over this, and unfortunately, we've had some bad apples, right? People who get into this preaching prosperity, and maybe they have the best of intentions, but it's so easy. The whole thing could be a drug, right? The fame and the popularity and all that, and people get into preaching a certain message, but then a lot of times we've seen those bad apples where people just don't manage their character well, and they get caught up into all kinds of scandals and cheating people. Here in Charlotte, North Carolina, Jim Baker happened in the 1980s, folks. There's still people I know to this day that are just devastated by something that happened in the late 80s because Jim and Tammy Faye Baker made their mistakes, right? So anyway, the point is, God does want his people to do well. I don't care what anybody says. God is not for poverty. Poverty was a sign that the land had been forsaken. There was sin in the land, right? Poverty is not of God. Being poor is not of God. And Abraham is a good example of what a person who is walking in the fullness of the call of what God has on their lives. And he knew how to steward that well and multiply it, right? That's the message of the kingdom of God, which is stewardship and multiplication. So anyway, let's move on, skip ahead to chapter 3, verse 8. So Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Okay, so Abraham and Lot were having their spat, right? Lot and his group were getting a little bit too big to be under his uncle's, in his uncle's shadow. And there was contention between the two camps. Verse 9, it says, is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take to the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. See, Abraham knew he did not want to be in direct competition with his nephew. And it's interesting. I've literally seen times where you have maybe siblings in a certain town where one sibling might have a certain business and the business is doing well. Then the other sibling, instead of joining the brother, will open up a competing business doing the same exact thing in the same general service area. Maybe time, maybe there's, maybe you're in a large city where you can do that. In this particular case, they weren't in a large city, but the idea is that Abraham knew what the market would bear for both of them, right? He knew that there was plenty of room for them to go their separate ways and both prosper, but what they had going on with their herds and the population of people with them, it just wasn't gelling anymore. And sometimes people have to go their different ways. Businesses have to split. Different departments have to be created to manage different things, right? There is just certain wisdom that Abraham had to understand this. He wasn't trying to force it. Well, you're my nephew, and this is what I've always done. I've always been there for you. How dare you step away from me? I've seen that. I've experienced it, right? People invest in you a bit, and then they think that you owe them for the rest of your life, and you're somehow supposed to sit around and carry on their legacy. Well, maybe there's something in those expectations definitely need to be discussed up front. But the idea was Abraham was not insecure with his nephew doing well. He was not insecure with the fact that there was competing herds and let's say caravans and employees under his nephew. He was comfortable with that, and he wanted him to do well. He was saying, you go this way, I'll go that way. There's plenty for all of us, but we can't keep working together. Love that principle. I have seen far too many insecure, whether it's pastors, Christian business leaders, or ministry leaders, where people really feel that anytime they sow into somebody, that person is somehow subservient to them moving forward, or that person is somehow needing to revolve their life around the affirmation of that initial person or them, kind of a thing. And I just never jive that way, right? I believe that God's given us all a unique fingerprint, a unique personality, and we need to work together. I'm not talking about going out and being orphans and flying by the seat of our pants. There's accountability, there's networking, partnership, covenants. There are things like that. But the idea that I'm emphasizing, Abraham was a profound businessman. He's not sitting around feeling sorry for himself simply because, oh, wow, my nephew who I invested in wants to go a separate way. Woe is me. I'm Abraham, and, I can't handle the fact, nope. Abraham knew who he was. He knew who his God was, and he moved forward with confidence, right? Verse 10, and Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go towards Zoar. Okay, so basically, and I even saw a documentary recently that this area was very lush. There's a lot of like seismic activity and stuff that over the years, there's been a lot of things that have completely changed the landscape, but whatever happened there, whether it was a meteorite, a volcano, there's been a lot of theories. Lot knew that this was a good area, and that's what he aimed for, right? And Abraham was okay with that. Abraham knew that he was going to good territory, but Abraham went in the opposite direction. All right, verse 14. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants forever. So isn't it interesting? Abraham had to make a decision, right? Abraham came to an agreement with Lot, his nephew, You go your direction, I'll go the opposite direction. And once that agreement was made and Abraham went his direction, that's when God blessed him, right? Sometimes we got to step out in faith, right? Sometimes God will bless us wherever we're at. I mean, I think about my first 30 years in Los Angeles, where I had a lot of, basically out of high school, my goal was to be a rock star, and I really wasn't a fan of going to school at the time. So I had normal retail jobs and things like that. But I always had the foundation of living with my parents, if that was the option or the best option at the time. And I had a lot of social equity. I eventually got into ministry in my early 20s. And so I had a lot of friends. I had a lot of people, a lot of places I could go if I needed something to do. But as far as the economic uh, abilities to provide for family, things like that, it just was not working out for that 30-year period. Or at least let's say that 10 years where I was between the age of 20 and 30. I kept hitting my head over this situation, that situation, making mistakes with the best of intentions, that kind of stuff. And I knew God was calling me to North Carolina. Flash forward, here I am almost 9 years in. Life is better than it's ever been, without question. Met my wife 5 years ago. Actually, well, married almost 5 years, but 6.5 years ago we met, dated for a year and a half, got married, and now we have a child. There's all kinds of things that have fallen into place that have made this by far the best time of my life, right? But it did require a step of faith. It required a stepping out, right? It's easy to say, well, this is what I know, my hometown, this is where my family's at, this and that. Of course, I wrestled with all those things. But I knew what God was telling me. I knew He was saying if I stepped out in faith to go to North Carolina, that Charlotte specifically, that He was eventually going to bring things together. And I've already had heart's desires fulfilled a number of times over. And the story of Abraham is one of the things that has inspired me along the way. So I just want to encourage anybody who's wrestling with that, right? If you feel like God is calling you to do something, but because of all these different variables that basically involve uncertainties, fear of rejection, fear of hurting people, that kind of stuff. If you know for a fact God's called you to do it, then He's going to work it out. Obviously, there's agreements, covenants, contracts, things like that. We have to fulfill the things that we have agreed to, of course, but we need to be where God's best is, not sitting around in something that seems good or familiar or comfortable, because we might miss the boat or miss the opportunity of a lifetime simply because, it's familiar and I don't like change, right? So God blessed Abraham once he made that move to step away from his nephew and go in one direction. And God said to him, I'm skipping ahead here. Verse 17, arise, walk into the land through its length, its width, for I give it to you. So God was familiarizing Abraham with this land. I remember watching an episode of Marcus Lemonis' show, The Prophet. And and I'm sure he's brought this up a number of times. It stood out to me one time. He went to a family fun center in Las Vegas, Nevada. And he was explaining the idea that the owners of any business, right? They should walk the parameters of this business that they own. They should know the ins and the out, right? They should notice if a handrail needs to be painted or a tree needs to be trimmed, right? They should have kind of this intimate understanding of the details of this land, right? Or this property, this business of theirs. So here God is telling him, walk the land through its length, its width, for I give it to you. Israel is definitely not nearly as big as I'd say most countries in the world, but that's still, they didn't have cars then, right? This would have been camels, horses, walking, carts that are being pulled, kind of a thing. This would have taken a little time to do. Verse 18, then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron. Let me move this thing so I can see. Which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. So God gave him a command to go and see the land. He did it. He found a place to settle, and then he built another altar, right? He had a lot of prayer points. He had a lot of places that was set up as a place where he had these encounters with God, where he set up a place where this was a sacred place for him to pray, to worship, to give sacrifices, things like that, right? Abraham was big on getting direction from the Lord, talking to the Lord, doing what the Lord said, building altars, right? He was very strategic in how he went about and did things. All right, so that is part 2 of the most famous businessman in history. Obviously talking about Abraham. And so we're going to continue this on. There's a number of different teachings that are going to happen, but I'm excited to unpack how he does transactions, how he interacts with people who love him, people who want to give him gifts, people who are villains in his mind. It's just really awesome. He set an example that we can definitely learn from even in modern days. So that was this episode of the KOG Entrepreneur Show. Again, I'm your host, Stephen Harris. I hope to see you all next time. And remember, the kingdom of God is within you always, so go and be fruitful and multiply. We'll see you next time. God bless.
So I want to walk through your sanctuary and stand